So we're going to be continuing our sermon series in Ecclesiastes. We're going to actually finish it up next week, but we're going to be in chapters 9 and 10 this week. And just a short recap about what the book is about to get us kind of back into it. The book of Ecclesiastes was written by Solomon as a reflection on his own life's experiences towards the end of his life. And he uses this term vanity, chabel in Hebrew, to speak of the dissatisfaction and the lack of fulfillment that we're going to feel in various aspects of life, especially when we don't live those in relation to God. Fulfillment and satisfaction can only be found in a relationship with God. I was actually reading a book for a class this week, and they quoted Ecclesiastes 12:13 as the lens through which to really read Scripture as a whole, but even they were talking specifically about the Gospels. So we're going to dive back into our text today in chapters 9 and 10. We're going to pray and then get right into this. Heavenly Father, we ask that you would be doing your work in us, that you help give us wisdom, your insight into how the world works and how you want us to live in it, and give us the strength through your Spirit to actually live that out. So show us the truth of your word this morning. Open our eyes to it, open our ears to it, open our hearts to it, and our minds to it, and strengthen us to live it. We ask this in Jesus' name. So Solomon continues in chapter 9. He says, "But all this I laid to heart, examining it all, how the righteous and the wise and their deeds are in the hand of God. Whether it is love or hate, man does not know. Both are before him. It is the same for all, since the same event happens to the righteous as the wicked, to the good and the evil, to the clean and the unclean, to him who sacrifices and him who does not sacrifice. As the good one is, so is the sinner. As he who swears is, as he who shuns an oath. This is an evil in all that is done under the sun, but the same event happens to all. Also, the hearts of the children of man are full of evil, and madness is in their hearts while they live. And after that, they go to the dead. But he who is joined with all the living has hope. For a living dog is better than a dead lion." That's a great, just that alone. Just put that on a bumper sticker, right? "For the living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing, and they have no more reward, for the memory of them is forgotten. Their love and their hate and their envy have already perished, and forever they have no more share in all that is done under the sun. Go, eat your bread with joy and drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has already approved what you do. Let your garments be always white. Let not oil be lacking on your head. Enjoy life with a wife whom you love all the days of your vain life that he has given you under the sun, because that is your portion in life, and in your toil at which you toil under the sun. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might. For there is no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol, to which you are going." There's more. Hold on. "Again, I say that under the sun, the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor the bread to the wise, nor riches to the intelligent, nor favor to those who with knowledge, but time and chance happen to them all. For man does not know his time. Like fish that are taken in an evil net, and like birds that are caught in a snare, so the children of man are snared in an evil time when it suddenly falls upon them." So, good news. Again, I just remind you, the outlook of Solomon in a lot of this we have to balance with two realities. First, he's saying all of this and then reflecting, this is what life is like apart from God. And then at the end of it, he says, but with God, there's hope in things. And I said this before, but keep in mind, Solomon is writing at a time that he does not understand the concept of resurrection. That is not something that God has revealed yet fully. He doesn't understand that there really is life after death. As far as Solomon knows, you die and you're done. And if you think, no, the Bible clearly teaches resurrection from the very beginning, it does not clearly teach resurrection from the very beginning. Most modern Jews do not believe in life after death. They believe you die and that's it. Even very devout Jews, a lot of them don't believe in resurrection. There are some that do, but not all of them. Because they're basing a lot of their theology on sections of the Old Testament, and then they look at the prophets and they say, there might be something coming, but we're not really sure. And we, on the other side of the cross, know the reality of resurrection life. Keep in mind that Solomon is talking through the lens of not knowing that reality. That doesn't make his words unimpactful. In fact, it actually gives us a greater insight into what he's saying. So, at the beginning of this, he basically says, listen, just to remind you all, death is a certainty for everybody. As Dick said, I've heard Dick, I'm sure he's quoting somebody else, but says this often. He goes, just remember, none of us get out of here alive, right? Mortality rate is 100% for humanity. We're all going to die. There's no way around it. There's only been possibly 2 people in history that have never died. Do you know that? 2. And I say possibly because at least one of them is a huge question mark. The prophet Elijah didn't die. It says God caught him up in a chariot, which is why there's a lot of references to Elijah in Scripture as kind of a harbinger or a forerunner of the Messiah and of the last days, because they're like, well, God took him, so obviously he's going to come back. Maybe. Jesus says that John the Baptist fulfilled that role. But the other person, anyone know? Enoch, right? Enoch, actually, we don't know if Enoch died. It says he was no more. He walked with the Lord, and then he was no more. And the thing is, that idiom could also just mean, and he died. We don't know. It doesn't explicitly say whether he died or not, but that expression has led some people to believe he didn't die. So, I don't know if you know this, but there are currently alive on planet Earth about the same number of people as we estimate have ever lived. Did you know that? And what I mean by that is there's currently about 8 billion people on our planet. By estimation, that's about how many people have lived in all of human history combined before this point. So let's say we'll round up, we'll say there's 20 billion people that have lived throughout human history, and 2 of them didn't die. Like, I don't say play the lottery, but if you think that you're not going to die, your odds of winning the lottery several times over are much higher. Like everyone dies. It's a certainty for all of humanity. Now, if we know Christ and Jesus returns, we won't die. We'll be instantly transformed. But again, if that happens in our lifetime, great. But if that doesn't happen in our lifetime, by definition, that means we die because our lifetime is ended. Death is a certainty for humanity. And whether we are righteous or wicked, it doesn't matter. We're all going to die. And at first, Solomon says this seems like an evil thing to say. Like, we all die whether we're righteous or wicked. Don't you think the righteous should keep living and the wicked should perish? Well, the long-term answer to that, according to God, is yes, that is true. Those who are truly righteous, made righteous by God through the sacrifice of Jesus, will live forever, but we will still experience a physical death unless we happen to be alive when Jesus returns. And that is what he's talking about here. He's talking about physical death, not spiritual death. He's not talking about hell and heaven. He's not talking about that. He's talking about the act of physical death. He says we're all going to experience it. But he actually says, rather than seeing it as an evil, death is actually a great equalizer. Because it doesn't matter how righteous or wicked you are, we all meet the same end, which means we all have to acknowledge that and live life with that in mind. He does say life is better than death because while we're alive, we still have hope. That great expression, a live dog is better than a dead lion. Especially for pets. I don't know if you know that, but a live dog is better than a dead lion for a pet, for sure. The solution to this inevitability of death, he says, though, is to enjoy our life. He says, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, in a nutshell. He says, enjoy what God has given you. It's a blessing. The things that come your way, God meant to give you, enjoy them. And that's how we should read this. When he says, when he makes the comment about what comes our way, it's kind of our, there's nothing we can do about it. It's allotted to us. That is meant to be like God. If something good comes your way, God intended that. If something bad comes your way, God also uses that. That's not outside of his sovereignty. So enjoy your life. Enjoy the things that come your way. Because you don't know how long you've got. And we should do this especially because life is fleeting. That's why he says, enjoy your vain life. That he doesn't mean that your life is empty and meaningless. He means it's fleeting. It's not going to last. So enjoy it. Yesterday we had a memorial service, a homegoing service, really, for John Myers. And friends and family were gathered and they're talking about John and his life. And what an example of the fleetingness of life. He lived his life well. He loved people well, but most importantly, he knew Jesus. We know that he's with Jesus. And yes, his family mourns. We mourn, but we also say he lived a good life, and now he gets to go home. Remember that Solomon didn't have that hope. But he said, even without that hope, enjoy what we have. But all the more so because we know where we're going. At the end of this, he says, and I'm going to just reread this verse for you. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might, for in Sheol, where you're going, there's neither working nor planning nor knowledge nor wisdom. If you don't know this, the term Sheol, some translations translate it the grave, which is a good translation. That is what that means. When you read the term Sheol in the Old Testament, sometimes it's not translated. I think it's probably just as easy to translate it as the grave. Sheol is not hell. That's the main thing. Understand that when you see the word Sheol in the Old Testament, it doesn't mean hell. It doesn't mean a place of punishment. It just means the grave or the place of the dead. It is actually there's an equivalent phrase used in the New Testament. Does anybody know what that is? Hades is the same thing in the New Testament. Hades is not hell in the New Testament. Gehenna or Tartarus is hell in the New Testament. Sheol and Hades just mean where you go when you die. It's not about judgment. It's just about like the grave. That's what it means. And he says, listen, we're all going there. We're all eventually headed there. And he said, when you're there, there's nothing you're going to do, so enjoy life now. So it's not hell, just to clarify that. We are called to be joyful and enjoy the blessings that God has given us while we live. This is a reflection on our mortality. And this is not the first time he's done this in this book. One of the things I said up front before we got into Ecclesiastes is Ecclesiastes is wisdom literature, which means it is deep and reflective, but it's also very repetitive. He's going to say the same things time and time and time again. And you might say, why does he do that? I mean, the way that my mind works is I would be like, okay, we're going to talk about this topic, and then we're going to talk about this topic, and then we're going to talk about this topic, and then we're going to talk about this topic, and I'm not going to go all over the place. Like, I've got kids with ADHD. I'm like, it's like he's all over the place. Why is just have it? I'm that kind of person. Like, I was a chemistry major the first couple years of college. You know the number one reason I like chemistry? You have a periodic table. Everything fits in a nice box. It's super, like, it's clean, it's neat, it's organized, everything makes sense. And then I remember being in biology and like physiology in high school, and I've been like, this squishy mess, no thank you. I don't like this. Oh, the system kind of works like this sometimes, unless it doesn't. I'm like, I don't like that. I like organization. That is, in a sense, that kind of squishy mess is how Ecclesiastes and most wisdom literature is written. And as much as that might frustrate us, like, why does he keep repeating himself? There's two reasons. First of all, because it reflects life more, the squishy mess of it, but also because in a sense, we constantly need to be reminded of this. Whether we realize this or not, this book was meant to be read in front of a congregation in a single sitting. Now, we're going through it in 6 weeks, which I feel is rushed, but that's what we're doing. And typically I edit the sermons online and stuff afterwards. I'm like, hey, 40, 45 minutes is typically how long the sermons are. In 6 weeks, that's like, do the math, that's 4.5, 5 hours. To read through this fully, it would take over an hour. And at the end of it, you'd be like, I don't remember most of what was just said, which is why you repeat yourself. If you're a parent, you know what I'm talking about, right? You're like, I know I had to say this like 12 times because it's not sinking in the first 11, and it probably didn't sink in the 12th time. It's the same thing. That's why there's a lot of repetition. So we're called, really, he says, as we reflect on our mortality, remember that we are called to enjoy all the blessings that God gives us, including our spouses, our family, and our work. Because those are blessings. They're meant to be blessings. And you might not always think of your spouse as a blessing, but they are. You might not always think of your family as a blessing, but they are. And I think a lot of times we don't think of our work as a blessing, but if we view it correctly, it is. Whatever God has called you to do vocationally, God has blessed you with the ability to do that, and you're supposed to do it with all of your might. It's talked about all throughout Scripture. And then he reflects on this. He says, reflecting on life, he says, keep in mind that as we live this life, we don't know how long it's going to last, but the only thing we're really guaranteed of is that we're going to all die. What we're not assured of is success. Regardless of what our giftedness is, our strengths are, natural talents and abilities, that is no guarantee of success in life. He actually says a lot of it seems to be almost happenstance. It almost just seems like it's blind luck. Now, it's not, but he says it seems that way to us. You'll see people that work really hard and they never seem to kind of quote unquote get ahead. You see some people that are just untalented and they're like, why are they like doing so well in life? They kind of stumble into success and you're like, I don't understand this. And he says, yep, we don't. We don't understand it. One of the things that I actually really like about the book of Ecclesiastes is Solomon is just so honest. In his wisdom, he is honest about the fact that he says, as I've lived a pretty long life at this point in time and experienced a lot of things, he says, and he is considered the wisest man to ever live. He says, life doesn't make sense. We need to learn to be okay with that. Things don't always make sense to us. They don't have to. We don't have to understand everything that's going on and why it happens. We simply need to accept what God has put before us as a blessing and be content with it and move forward. Because he says otherwise, it will drive us mad. He even says that madness is something that as humans we experience, and sometimes it's because we're reflecting on these things in such a way that we're like, but this doesn't make sense. And he's like, yeah, it doesn't. But part of the reason that life doesn't always make sense to us is because there are two opposing factors always going on within life. And those factors are the sovereignty of God that is unseen in its work, and the sinfulness of man, which is constantly seeking to thwart the sovereignty of God. It doesn't thwart it, but certainly seeks to. We live in a fallen world, and yet God is still sovereign. And those two things do not seem to make sense together. And Solomon says, trying to figure out all the minutia of how that works together will drive you insane. Instead, just realize God is in control. The world isn't always fair, but it'll all work out. And then just enjoy what you have before you. The only guarantee that we have in life is that it ends in death. And this would be depressing to say, wait, you're saying it doesn't matter how hard I work, I'm not guaranteed that I'm going to get what I want? No, you're not. I know that kind of flies in the face of the American dream, but that's true. It's true. You might not get what you want. And if you think that concept with the concept that we're all going to die is depressing, it would be if that was the end of the story. But it's not. It's not the end of the story. If we shift our mindset from thinking about this life as the be-all, end-all of existence and say, well, if this is it, then all that matters is that I get everything I can get right now, then we will always be discontent, just dissatisfied, and probably depressed. But if we realize this is not what we're made for, this is the preamble, this is the prologue, that this life is the first chapter of an infinite story, then it can shift our focus. And like I said, Solomon didn't understand that fully. But hopefully we do. If we know Christ, we should understand that death for us is not the end, it's literally the beginning. When Christ returns and we're raised and we get to rule and reign with him for eternity, our life now will seem like it wasn't, like as Solomon describes it, a vapor, like a moment in time, like not really that big of a deal. I know I often quote C.S. Lewis. He's one of my favorite authors. He talks about this, and again, I'm paraphrasing, I'm not quoting him, but he talks about how everything. Have any of you guys ever read the book The Last Battle by C.S. Lewis? It's the last book of the Chronicles of Narnia series. He talks about that. He talks about going further up and deeper in. And when the characters in the book are all talking about, like, this is it, this is the end, he goes, the end? No, this is the beginning. This is Aslan, who represents Christ. No, this is the beginning. Everything in your life has led to this moment so that you can really start embracing what life was always meant to be. This was to prepare you for what is next. Everything we go through is to prepare us for eternity. But eternity is the big show. That's the main event. This is the first chapter. And when we don't realize that, when we think the first chapter is all that we have, we will find life to be just pointless. You ever read a book, a multiple chaptered book, and if you stopped at the end of the first chapter and said, I guess that's it, you'd probably be like, this book is not great. Because in the first chapter of most books, especially, there's a lot of strife and there's conflict being set up and all this stuff. It's not till you get to the end of that book and realize, maybe we're getting to a happily ever after. No, like it's the setup, right? And that's how we have to view life. Our life here and now is the setup for eternity. We have to have that mentality. That does not mean that our life right now is not important. It is. It's extremely important. Because it determines what happens in the rest of our story. But it is not the rest of our story. And one of the ways that is determined is by what we do with wisdom and folly, which is what he goes into next. He said, I've also seen this example of wisdom under the sun, and it seemed great to me. There was a little city with few men in it, and a great king came against it and besieged it, building great siege works against it. But there was found in it a poor, wise man, and he, by his wisdom, delivered the city. Yet no one remembered that poor man. But I say that wisdom is better than might. Though the poor man's wisdom is despised, and his words are not heard. The words of the wise heard in quiet are better than the shouting of a ruler among fools. Wisdom is better than weapons of war. This is beginning chapter 10. One sinner destroys, this is the very end of chapter 9, actually. One sinner destroys much good, the beginning of chapter 10. Dead flies make the perfumer's ointment give off a stench. So a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. Let's stop for a second. Right now, Solomon's going to start talking about using a bunch of metaphors to talk about how wisdom is more important, but folly has this horrible effect upon wisdom. I love that first one. Dead flies make the perfumers and get off a stench. Oh, what a beautiful perfuming balm that you have. It's full of dead flies because they were attracted to it, and then they died there, and now it smells like dead flies. He's like, you don't want to smear that on yourself. That's horrible. He goes, that's like a little bit of folly and much wisdom. It ruins it. So little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. A wise man's heart inclines him to the right, but a fool's heart to the left. By the way, the word left in Hebrew and in Greek, it means scandalous. It's a play on words. Even while the fool walks on the road, he lacks sense. And he says to everyone that he is a fool. If the anger of the ruler rises against you, do not leave your place, for calmness will lay great offenses to rest. There is an evil that I have seen under the sun, as it were an error proceeding from the ruler. Folly is set in many high places, and the rich sit in a low place. I've seen slaves on horses and princes walking on the ground like slaves. He who digs a pit falls into it, and a serpent will bite him who breaks through a wall. He who quarries stones is hurt by them, and he who splits logs is endangered by them. If the iron is blunt and one does not sharpen the edge, he must use more strength, but wisdom helps one succeed. If the serpent bites before it is charmed, there is no advantage to the charmer. The words of a wise man's mouth win him favor, but the lips of a fool consume him. The beginning of the words of his mouth is foolishness, and the end of his talk is evil madness. A fool multiplies words, though no man knows what it is to be, and who can tell him what will be after him? The toil of a fool wearies him, for he does not know the way to the city. And I just read through a lot of stuff, and I said this before we started this sermon series. I'm not going to go through every line and talk about what every line means. I would highly encourage you to spend time doing that. What we're doing is a much larger picture of what Solomon is talking about. And then you can go back and say, okay, if this is the general theme of this section, then I can read it and understand it from that perspective. I'm doing that intentionally. That's both for time's sake, but also because a lot of these are written proverbially, meaning that they are situational. And when we're in those situations, if you go through and talk about well, this situation's like this and this situation's like that, that is, it gets overwhelmingly, it'll bog you down, and you kind of miss the tree or the forest for the trees. And I'm trying to give us a picture of the forest a little bit more with this, to encourage you as you read through this that God will enliven you and lighten your eyes to this. So he lays out here, while we're in this life, we need to live with wisdom and not folly. And he sets up what is the difference between wisdom and folly. And the end of chapter 9 through most of chapter 10, he's setting out this dichotomy, this two settings, the wisdom setting and the folly setting. And he says, wisdom is superior to strength. It's better to have wisdom than to be strong. Though he says, ironically, we often refuse wisdom, seeking it only when we're desperate. When our strength fails, then we'll turn to wisdom. And he uses a bunch of examples of this in the end of chapter 9, but even in chapter 10, when he's like, hey, he uses a wood splitting analogy. And as somebody who grew up splitting wood a lot, I'm like, what a great analogy. Which he says, listen, if you have a dull axe, you have to work harder. Right? Sharpen the axe, it makes your job a lot easier. That's true, right? Now, that might sound like situational wisdom, but he's actually getting at a bigger issue. He says, thus it is like for wisdom. Sharpen your mind to wisdom so that you make better choices. It will make your life go better. Makes your life easier. So wisdom is superior to strength. It's not a safeguard, however, against harm, but can minimize it by preparation and foresight. And this is where he talks about things like sharpening your axes and things like, like as you work in a quarry to get stone, that's great, but that stone could harm you. So he's like, you can plan and make some preparation and have some foresight It's not going to guarantee nothing bad's going to happen to you, but it's better to do that than the alternative. I know I used this example last week, but it's like when you watch videos of people like, I don't have to watch videos, I grew up with people like this, where like, hey, you're with a group of guys, it's always guys, I'm sorry, men, I don't know what way, where you're like, hey, we're gonna paint this wall and it's way taller than our ladder. Well, I got an idea, we'll just put it on top of this other thing, and you're like, OSHA's coming by and like, this is not okay, and we're like, it's fine. And just put it in the back of the truck and just drive the truck forward while I'm on the ladder. This is foolish, right? Like, just take the time, get down, do it the right way. That's what he's talking about. Like, it's like, you might still fall off the ladder if you're doing everything safe, but don't set yourself up to fail. Don't be foolish about those things. Be wise. And not just in those kind of areas, but in life in general. These are proverbial statements, and proverbial statements are meant to say, here is an example, now apply that to the broader picture of life in whatever setting you're in. Okay, you might be like, I'm not cutting wood. I don't care about a sharp axe. Okay. Are there areas of your life that doing a little bit of preparation would make the work easier? Well, sure. That's what it's saying. That's all it means. Might not be specifically axes and wood. It might be, though. You might feel like, man, this is really practical. I'm going to take it. He says, wisdom uses few words, and it uses those words for the benefit of others. Wisdom is few in its words, and they use them for the benefit of others. It says in Proverbs, in fact, I think this is actually one of Solomon's Proverbs. It says, words fitly spoken are like apples of gold and settings of silver. One of my favorite Proverbs. It also says, this is a paraphrase. This is like a New Living Translation, but it basically says, better to keep your mouth closed and be thought a fool than to open your mouth and remove all doubt. The more you speak, the more foolish you look. Think about all the wise statements you've ever heard. Are they long and complicated? Actually, something about something being short, concise, and to the point actually penetrates and distills wisdom much better than something. If you've got to take 15 sentences to describe something, you probably don't really have a grasp of it. Few words, and for the benefit of others, not for yourself, not self-indulgent, benefit of others. Folly, on the other hand, and he starts really getting into this into chapter 10 more, on the end of 9, he says, can ruin great wisdom. You can have a lot of wisdom and a little bit of folly, and it really messes it up. And he uses that perfumer and the dead flies analogy. But he also says it's always going to be found out, though it can rise to great positions. I like this. He says, this is verses 4 through 7, he says, that's the way he says it, if a ruler's anger rises against you, do not leave your post. Calmness can lay great errors to rest. In other words, just give it time. There is an evil I've seen under the sun, the sort of evil that arises from a ruler. Fools are put in many high positions, while the rich occupy the low ones. I have seen slaves on horseback, while princes go on foot like slaves. Now, you might say, he's saying that rich people are in low positions. He is not talking about socioeconomic status. He's not talking about like monetary wealth. He's talking about people who are rich and poor when it comes to wisdom. The idea of slaves and princes and the rich and poor here, this is not a comment on social status, it's on moral character and wisdom. He's going to use the same language later. So when you read that, let me read that again, and keep in mind that he's talking about, and I'll just kind of translate it as I go here. He goes, fools are put in many high positions, while the rich, the wise, occupy the low ones. I have seen slaves, that is, those who are morally questionable on horseback, while princes, those who are morally solid, go on foot like slaves. He says sometimes that's the wiser thing to do. And he's saying that it seems like there's this juxtaposition that what is going on that you have all of these, like sometimes really foolish people in like high positions in companies and government and things like that. He goes, Yeah, it's kind of messed up, isn't it? It does happen. And he's saying it's like that's just it, that is the way of the world. It shouldn't be that way. It shows a brokenness in our world. I'm sure some of you have heard this expression before, but like often people within, especially like bigger companies, they get promoted to the level of their incompetence. Like, oh, you're really good at this job, so that must mean we're going to promote you to the next position up to oversee that. And you're like, being good at this position isn't going to make you necessarily good at the overseeing those people. In fact, you're probably better off, like a lot of times, staying in that position because you're doing that job well. And a lot of times, we don't understand that. And a good example, just in general, is sometimes people that are great workers are horrible managers. And I've seen some people like who work in those, they're like, yep, yeah, I could think of. And that's what it is. Sometimes we're like, well, we want to reward, and it's like, it doesn't necessarily always work that way. And sometimes people get ahead by really horrible moral means, and then they misuse their positions, and we see this in companies, we see this in politics, we see this in all kinds of things. And he's saying that is a brokenness in the world. Yeah, that's folly. That's not something that we should pursue. He says you're better off being in a low position, being wise, than being the CEO, but being a fool. And then he says that folly plans evil schemes, and then they find that they often backfire. Not always, but eventually they backfire. But folly is, they'll want to take shortcuts. They'll try to do like scheming and trying to, and then those plans backfire on them, and then they get found out. And we see that all the time. You see, like, I think of Boeing. Have you guys been paying attention to what's going on with Boeing? Boeing's like, let's take these shortcuts to save all this money, and meanwhile they're like, oh, we're just not putting parts on planes. If you hear the story of how they got to that position, it's insane. I don't know if you know this, and I'll give this a short version of this. Boeing used to be the pinnacle of aviation. My sister was an aerospace engineer in college and worked for McDonnell Douglas for a little while, and Boeing was their rival. McDonnell Douglas went bankrupt. If you don't know this, Boeing bought them out. They went bankrupt because of bad management practices. McDonnell Douglas was merged with Boeing. They bought them out, but they merged, and the deal was you have to keep on all the McDonnell Douglas managers. They are now all in the positions of leadership in Boeing. They literally took the people that made all these foolish decisions that put that company in bankruptcy, and their bankruptcy was because they were making horrible, not listening to their engineers and the people on the ground, and then suddenly they're like, well, now those people are in charge of this bigger company, and guess what's happening? We see this all the time. And just like the opposite of wisdom, folly uses many words, and they're only to benefit oneself. Like I said, the more we speak, the more foolish we look. That's what Solomon says. And often we use those words to try to justify our sinful behavior, or we're trying to sound really smart, and we're just looking really dumb. And we don't want to do that. And then at the end of this, he says, folly does not give true insight. He kind of gives a good analogy. It's like they walk on the road, but they don't know the way to town. Like, the road goes to town. How could you be walking on the road? And he's like, they're showing they're a fool because they don't even know. They're like, which way to town? And they're like, I don't know. And you're like, you're walking on the road, man. Like, where are you going? I'm going to town. Which way is it? I don't know. There's only two options. You came from that way. It's got to be the other way. The idea is they have no insight into life. And then he ends this chapter 10 by saying this: woe to you, O land, where your king is a child, and your princes feast in the morning. Happy are you, O land, when your king is the son of the nobility, and your princes feast at the proper time, for strength and not for drunkenness. Through sloth the roof sinks in, and through indolence the house leaks. Bread is made for laughter, and wine gladdens life, and money answers everything. Even in your thoughts do not curse the king, nor in your bedroom curse the rich, for the bird of the air will carry your voice, or some winged creature tell the matter. So he ends this chapter by giving another reflection on kind of rulers. And he says, the mark of a good leader is their wisdom. And those who have no self-control and are childish will ruin the land. By the way, this was written 3,000 years ago. Has anything changed? When it says there, woe to you, O land, whose child is a king, or king is a child. Some translations have a different word there, but the word is childish. It means that they are, it doesn't mean like they're young. It can mean that, but it's implying they're foolish. They're not acting like a grown-up. They're acting childish in their behavior. They don't have self-control. And he says they'll ruin the land. Again, this idea of child and princes and nobility and all this is comments on not on social status, but on moral character. Are they wise or are they unwise? Are they moral or are they immoral? Morality matters with leaders. We used to really believe that as a country. I don't think we do anymore because none of them are moral. And so we're like, well, let's pick the lesser of evils. I'm like, there is no lesser of evils. Morality matters. It leads your country in one direction or another. And Solomon, who is the king, is the one saying this. By the way, if you know anything about Solomon's life, was Solomon a really upright and moral man? For a lot of his life, he was not, and he's saying that. And if you think that this is just an empty statement, what happened to the kingdom of Israel after Solomon's death? It split, civil war. Why? Because of his behavior. His children were spoiled. They did not act appropriately. They were immoral, and it split the kingdom, literally upon his death. And it never was reunited. Never. To this day, it hasn't been reunited. He is speaking out of experience. And he goes on to say, sloth is dangerous. Being lazy is dangerous, both personally and nationally. When we are unwilling to do hard work, our household and our nation suffers. Like I said, we sang America the Beautiful this morning. That wasn't planned. That was divine coincidence. This is true. Solomon says, if as a nation, as citizens within a nation, we are unwilling to do hard work, our nation will suffer. Just like in your house. If you're like, hey, we're not going to do hard work, your house will suffer. He says your roof will start collapsing and everything will fall apart because you're not maintaining it. Same is true as a nation. Now, it's interesting that we could spend a whole lot of time just on that topic. Solomon spends 4 verses on it, and then he moves on. And if you say, why doesn't he spend more time? If this is so important, why doesn't he spend more time on it? He is capstoning part of his argument here. What I'm saying is, he's saying, listen, live wisely, not foolishly, because remember that your behavior affects the people around you. It affects your house. It affects your community. It affects your country. Your behavior affects things. Now notice, he is he'll call out negative behavior, but then the call is to us, for us to have the right behavior. And by the way, to put this in modern terms, if the Christian church in the country that we live in doesn't want to act wisely, we shouldn't be screaming that the world isn't. Of course the world doesn't act wisely. To be wise is centered on knowing God. And if we're not going to do it, they're not going to do it. We have to set that example. So here's our so what. Since life is fleeting, are we enjoying our blessings in the Lord? Are we pursuing wisdom or are we pursuing folly? And do we see how our actions affect those around us, both in our household and our nation? Like I said, this is very much a 50,000-foot overview of Ecclesiastes. You can take every verse in this and reflect on how it applies to your life. This section is about this, and this is the implications of that. But that's why I've been giving you guys reading assignments with this, so that as we were reading through the text, we can ask God to be doing that work, because wisdom is not just having knowledge, it's about the Holy Spirit applying it to our lives. That has to happen in our relationship with God. Mike, you've got prayer today, is that right? I'm going to ask Mike to come up while I read the meditation verse here. Our meditation verse for today is from Ecclesiastes 9:17. The words of the wise heard in quiet are better than the shouting of a ruler among fools. And then our scripture reading is Ecclesiastes 11 and 12. Come on up, Mike.